Okay, sounds good.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Ticklish Business. I'm Kristen Lopez here with I'm going to say very good friend, even though we've only ever talked on Instagram and social media. We are talking about your amazing new book about Anna May Wong, Katie Salisbury. How are you?
I'm good, good. Just back from the AFI Silver Classics Festival this past weekend.
How is that? Because I feel like I should be going to that, but it's far away because I'm in LA. So
Right, yeah. Well, it was easy for me to get down there from New York to DC, or to Maryland, I should say. It was great. I mean, I only got to stay for 2 days, but it was really fun. This year's theme was like pre-code, sex, and something else, but it was a lot of female-driven films actually, and so I enjoyed that a lot. And of course, they were screening two Anna May Wong films, so I was there to introduce them. But it was great. I mean, it was a great crowd. Really like you know very well-studied film people who, I mean, had great questions, but also like taught me some things. I learned a lot just from having conversations with them, so it was a great experience.
that's awesome. And of course, it makes sense you're talking about Anime Wong. Your book, Not Your China Doll, is awesome. I've read it and there's a couple anime books out there that exist, but for me, I might be putting words in your mouth, but it's one of the few books that I can recall not just telling us about Anime Wong's life, but also her kind of dividedness of being Chinese American and the fact that she was often considered not Chinese enough to be accepted by China, but not American enough to be fully embraced by America. Can you take us back to the beginning and why you wanted to write? I know you have a beautiful intro where you talk about, the history of why you're interested in Anime Wong and how it connects to your own life. Can you talk about why you wanted to embark on this project?
Sure. So, uh, basically 20 years ago, I was a college intern at the Chinese American Museum in Los Angeles. And so on my first day at the museum, I was given a tour of some of the exhibitions, and one was like a room of black and white photographs of Chinatown in Los Angeles throughout the years. And for whatever reason, there was like one photograph that really stuck out to me, and Anna May Wong was in it. And so I asked, who is this woman? And so when I was told she was this internationally famous Chinese American movie star from the 20s and 30s, I was just like so shocked. I couldn't imagine that someone like her had existed. And then like the fact that she had existed and no one had ever told me about her was like, how is that possible? I mean, I'm, part Chinese. My mom was born in Chinatown in Los Angeles and grew up there until she was 5. I grew up in an Asian American community. So I was like, no one seems to know about who she is anymore because I went around and asked people. And so it felt like, I personally wanted to learn more about her, but I also felt like, wow, this is kind of an injustice that such an important figure in early Hollywood hasn't been remembered and we don't know her legacy today. So that really put me on a path to, well, eventually writing this book. Of course, took some time to figure out how to do that. And then I spent the last 5 years, deeply researching and writing it. But I think the other thing that drew me to anime was just the overlap in our family histories. So I'm a fifth generation Chinese American. Anna May Wong was third generation when she was born in 1905. So her parents were both born in California, and it was her grandparents who came over for during the gold rush era. And so her family is also from Toisan, which is this area in southern China, which is where my family is from. Um, you know, my mom grew up in LA. She grew up in LA. I think she also reminded me a lot of my mother because my mom is so American. It was hard. A lot of times it's hard to explain that to people. Um, because even now, even though I think most people know like what it is to be a hyphenated American, even now it's hard sometimes for people to understand what it means to be fully American, but yet ethnically Chinese and still have certain ties to your culture. So I saw a lot of my mom in her because my mom was also a rebel and like kind of fiercely independent, but also very stylish and hip when she was young. She used to sew her own clothing. So there was just like an instant kinship between the two. And I had, of course, seen photographs of my mom as a little girl from the 1950s. So also this sense of like seeing a Chinese American person in a historical period, which we don't often see in history books, that also really stuck with me. So yeah, so in a way, you know, writing this book about Anna May Wong has been a way for me to also just learn more about my own history as a Chinese American.
Exactly. Why do you think it is? What's always fascinating to me is that when people say they don't know certain old Hollywood stars, like they know the Dietrichs and people where you're just kind of like, huh, okay. There's always like one weird person that like culturally we all know. But
Hmm,
anime, like you said, is really this unknown entity that I thought would see a cultural resurgence when Ryan Murphy did Hollywood, and she did for a little bit. But why do you think time has kind of muted her awareness to classic film fans?
right. Well, I mean, part of it is who's telling the history, right? I mean, you know, to be blunt, like if you have, you know, a bunch of white men telling Hollywood history, then who are they going to focus on? Not Anna May Wong. And that's been the case for most of, you know, the last 100 years. Um, but you know, there are other aspects to it too. I mean, she died in 1961, so the 60s was a really turbulent time. It was also the era in which the term Asian American was first coined. And a lot of Asian American activists at that time were really not interested in her. They felt like she was old guard, like she was the problem, right? Because she embodied all these stereotypes. And so they really, in a sense, like blamed her for like, you know, making Asian women overly sexualized, not understanding that, you know, she had very little choice in the matter, and that like, you know, it was play these roles or don't appear at all. But you know, but that was kind of the case, and so she was not someone they wanted to champion. So there's that aspect of it. And I think, you know, on some level too, the family, her family was a bit scarred by the way she had been treated in Hollywood, so they were a bit reticent to talk about her because they didn't want to open her up to new, you know, more criticism, right, in her death. So I think there's a lot of those things. And then, you know, more recently, you know, because people have asked me like, well, why do you think there's all this attention on her now? And part of me feels that it does have something to do with the renaissance that we're witnessing of like Asian American storytelling in
Yeah.
Hollywood, right? Because people are starting to look backwards and like wonder like, well, where do we come from? Like where were we before all of these, you know, things started to change and happen for Asian Americans in cinema and on television? And if you go back far enough, it's Anna May Wong.
Exactly. And I think too, there's this real cultural reevaluation that people have of like wanting to go back and find people that have been marginalized historically and lift them back up. I think we're really curious about who was the first, black film director, who was the first Asian American. Like, we definitely have this desire to go back and kind of correct history, knowing that it's often, you know, written by the winners, so to speak, which is predominantly white men. I'm writing a book about disability right now, and it's all about white men in a lot of ways. Um, do you remember the first Anime Wong movie you saw?
That's a great question. I think it was Shanghai Express. Yeah, so I started doing some, you know, I learned about her freshman year, and then I started doing some research on her because I was going to write my thesis about, well, I did write my thesis about perceptions of China through American cinema in the 1930s. And so I wanted to write about her, and ultimately I didn't find a film that fit what I was looking at, but I did. There's the Stanford Theater in Palo Alto,
Mhm.
which is this really great theater, and they have like a Wurlitzer too that like will come up from like
I
during,
love that. I love that.
yeah. Yeah, so I would go to like double features, and then the Wurlitzer would come up and they would play, you know, anyway, so it was really amazing. But I'm pretty sure that's where I saw Shanghai Express for the first time, which I enjoy, but I remember leaving and thinking, gosh, I just wish she had more screen time in that film.
Exactly. And you emphasize that a lot, that most of the critic reviews at the time for her film said, why is she not in this movie more? And I think that that is something that a lot of people don't know, and
Mhm.
that's mentioned in several interviews throughout the course of her career, is that people assume that while yes, Hollywood racism did limit her career here, there were American critics that were emphasizing, like, why is she not playing Olan in The Good Earth? Like,
Mhm.
there was criticism from others about how the studio was treating her at the time.
Yeah, I mean, that was really indicative to me that it's not that people, because that's a lot of times that's what people like to say. Oh, people weren't ready for her, right? She was
Yeah.
before her time, and they say this about so many different people, right? And it's if you actually look at what was going on during that time, people were ready. They were happy to see a Chinese American actress on the screen because she was good and she was beautiful and she, was talented. Like it didn't matter to them, and she was playing, she was playing Asian parts, right? So, I mean, there was no issue with that. Um, but it comes down to like who's making the decisions, right? That it's the people at the top, it's the producers, and they're the ones who are deciding, well, here's what we think people want, or in a sense, it's really what they want. Right. And that still happens today because I've heard some conversations about, like how Fresh Off the Boat happened and things like that. And oftentimes it happens because there's an Asian producer in the room who helps make that decision. And that, that's kind of explains to you like why it's taken so long to see this type of change.
Definitely. And for I'm just always fascinated by the process of biography writing because I feel like it's incredibly hard and I'm not built for it yet. But you mentioned she died in the early 1960s. A lot of stars of that era, the only publicity they did was studio crafted publicity. And there's a lot of question about how much is true and how much was actually said by the real person. How was the research component? Because you're also going into China and looking at research from a different country. Like, what was the process of
Mhm.
getting beyond the studio created view of Anna May Wong and telling the truth about her?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think in one sense, because she wasn't, I mean, in many ways, she was a bit more of a freelancer, right? I mean, she did do spurts at different studios, and of course, Paramount was as close as her home studio to any of them. She did the most of her films there. But they weren't, she didn't have like a 7-year contract like Marlene Dietrich, right?
Yeah.
So they weren't I don't think the studios were quite as involved in her publicity. And she herself just maintained, well, she became friends with a lot of the reporters and people at the Los Angeles Times, and of course Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons and all of those people. So she became very friendly. I mean, she was very shrewd, right? She understood how those things worked. But that said, you try to, what I tried to do at least is like pull as much as I can. Like, let's cull all the articles, pull everything, look at it, and like sift through it. Like, what if out of all of these things, like what makes the most sense? Because of course there are certain stories she would tell over and over again. And sometimes the details of the story change. And so you have to figure out like, well, which part of this story is the more true way or more plausible, or like, sometimes you just realize you can't include certain things like the number of extras that they were recruiting. Like sometimes it's 300, sometimes it's 600. I don't know, it could be any of those things. But I do think that she herself, I mean, she did so many interviews and also wrote a number of memoir type pieces that were very writerly, and her voice comes through very clearly. I mean, of course, she's, obviously crafting them in a way because she wants to send a certain message. But comparing, you compare everything, you sift through everything, and try to get down to the essence of like what was true. And that's also why I tried to let her speak for herself as much as possible, so that you as the reader can get a sense of who she is, but also you can maybe come to your own conclusions about some of the things that she says. I don't necessarily have to tell you what to think about them, even though I have my own opinions. But yeah, I mean, it was an incredible, when I started this project, I didn't really realize I was writing a biography because I just knew that I needed to write about her. And then, as I embarked on it, people kept saying, well, so is it a biography? And I was like, well, yeah, I guess so. Um, but yeah, so it was an incredible amount of research because you really want to get it right. But yeah, there's so many different things that I went through because she doesn't have like a centralized paper. She doesn't have papers really. She has, these interviews and memoirs that were published. She has like almost a 40-year correspondence with Carl Van Vechten that's held at Yale. Um, I mean, there's a ton of, all these different articles, Los Angeles Times, New York Herald Tribune, stuff everywhere. I mean, for the Chinese articles, luckily, like I studied Mandarin in college, but I mean, I am far from being literate. So what I ended up having to do is I went to this archive of Chinese movie magazines at Berkeley, and they're also written in traditional Chinese, which I learned simplified. So there's another complication. It's like more complicated to read. So I wouldn't be able to read it. So what I did was I just memorized what her name looked like. And so I would go through the magazines and just look for her name. And when I found her name, I would scan all the like related pages. And then later I had someone help me translate it. So yeah, so there is a little bit of detective work there. Of course, I spent a lot of time at the Academy Library in Los Angeles. I also went to BFI in London to watch some of her rare European films. So it was a lot of different things. And, I mean, you never stop finding new things that kind of slightly change your understanding of the person. And so I mean, when you really think about it, like a biography of an entire person's life, like it really tests like what is the nature of truth, right? Like who is this person? I mean, because you have to ask yourself that about yourself, right? Like who am I?
Right.
And you evolve and change over time. So you do the best that you can and understand that like new things will come to light. And you know, it's kind of a never ending like treasure hunt. So it's still fun to like find little tidbits here and there.
Did anything come to light after the book came out?
That's a good question. Anything big? Well, yeah. So there's a couple things, and I hope to write about this in my newsletter, Half Caste Woman, at some point. Um, so for example, okay, Anna May's younger sister, Mary, often worked as her stand-in in like
Right.
the late 1930s, and been stated by many previous biographers that Mary also had a part in The Good Earth as the little bride, because there was an actress named Mary Wong. But more and more, because if there is a photograph of her, but it's really hard. First of all, the photograph of her in the film, you can't really see her face because it's shrouded by like a this beaded headdress. But there's another photo of her off screen with the rest of the Chinese kind of actors who got cast in the film, and it doesn't look like Mary Wong. And I don't know why I never questioned this at the time, but I'm more and more I'm thinking there's no way that's her sister because they never talked about it. Anna May Wong and no one in the family ever mentioned Mary being in that film. So I think it's just a case of two Asian women with the same name.
Exactly. And it shows often. This is something that I talk about a lot as somebody that loves, Veronica Lake, who has so many stories that just kind of get passed down. But it
Mm,
shows kind of how with biography and old Hollywood, this happens a lot in old Hollywood. A story gets told and then it
hmm.
just kind of gets passed through the years until somebody in this case, thinks like, actually, maybe we should be questioning that a bit more.
Right. Yeah. Like maybe we should look at this again and not just accept the received story. I mean, and it's hard because we have such I think many people revere the written word when it's published in a book, but the reality is that books aren't fact checked
Yeah.
unless the author themselves pays someone to fact check it, which I did.
Yep.
um but even then, like there's only so far you can, because if you're citing another book, then it's assumed that what that other book said was true, right? So you really have to like dig into some of these things, which I did do with some other, kind of rumors and allegations from previous biographers. But with this one, I kind of just like, oh, well, it's probably her, whatever, put it in. And now I'm like, actually, I think so. That's something I need to look at again.
When you bring up rumors and all of that, and what I noticed about your book as I was reading it is that oftentimes I will complain lovingly about, how biographies often focus strictly on the professional because that's easy to document. And then they ignore the personal, which is where I'm like, I want to know more. But as I
Mm,
was reading this, I never questioned, like, I didn't really care to know who Anna May Wong was dating at the time because I was
mm,
so enthralled by the story that you're telling about her family and how she's inhabiting these two worlds. But I mean, one of the biggest rumors that is espoused is that she is a queer icon, that she
yeah.
was bisexual.
Mm.
I mean, was that something you wanted to look at, or how did you kind of reconcile with that story that has been kind of passed down in a way that you're not really sure where this story started, but it's never
Mhm.
been definitively, proven or disproven?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I was really interested to find out, like, is it true? Because of course, if it is true, that's something I think that's very interesting to most of us.
Sure.
And what I found, I mean, I didn't find anything that corroborated it because, when I looked through the sources that other biographers had cited, they led to other books that had no citations and
Yeah, like
no.
the sewing circle and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So there was nothing there. And then I thought, okay, well, if they were such good friends as everyone says, then there should be instances of them in papers and social columns hanging out. I found nothing, literally nothing, like nothing in English media. I tried my best to look through German media and they never showed up like in the same place other than the photographs we've seen of them, right? Like that famous
Yeah.
ball in 1930 with Leni Riefenstahl. And then, of course, on the set of Shanghai Express, and then perhaps in passing at different times and at Paramount when they were both working there. And those accounts are really coming from Marlena's daughter, Maria Riva, who was on set with them. And so I reached out to her. She was like 96 at the time. And I basically said, there's all these rumors about your mother and Anna May Wong having a romantic affair. And she said, absolutely not. They were friendly as young women at that age were, but they were not lovers. And so, I mean, I take her word because she wrote pretty detailed accounts of her mother's affairs with other people.
Right.
So that made sense to me. And then, I mean, if you look at some of the other things that were written about Marlena at that time, well, and the fact that Marlene Dietrich never even mentions Anna May Wong in her own memoir and doesn't even really comment on on Shanghai Express, like it seemed like a strange omission. Um, I started to see things that made it seem like they were much more like rivals, like professional rivals, than they were friends. And maybe they were friendly, but more like frenemies. But yeah, I mean,
Exactly.
it's difficult it's a difficult thing to deal with because of course I mean, of course I love that Anna May Wong is a gay icon I hate to be the person who, like, people are so excited to embrace her as a queer icon. And I hate to be the person to be like, well, I don't think she was queer, but she of course was an ally and she had lots of friends who were gay and lesbian. And like, I think she felt a solidarity with them as marginalized people. And then, what it boils down to is that this is something that other biographers put out there in a way that I personally feel was irresponsible. And people have come to believe it as truth. And it's hard to be the person who says, sorry, that's not true when it's like something we want to embrace.
Exactly. When I think what's fascinating about the book is that, Anna May Wong never married, never had
Mhm.
children. And as, somebody who is fascinated by, the concept of motherhood in this time period, because so often women did have children and then
Mhm.
ended up being terrible mothers or regretted the decision. You know, you talk about the few relationships that are known about, Anna May Wong. But can you talk a little bit about the decision that she ultimately came to not marry, which I think is revolutionary for the time period,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's still revolutionary.
right?
I
Right?
mean,
It really, but I think too, especially for like the Hollywood system where it's like you had to be a perfect wife and a perfect mother, but men weren't expected to be perfect husbands, perfect
mhm,
fathers. For
right.
her to like openly say, "Nope, just not gonna do that." Like she kind of is the Taylor Swift in a way of the that time period of just kind of like screw convention.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because, she's asked that question, are you going to get married over and over again throughout her career at different stages? And so if you look at her answers over time, they're all different. And it kind of just feels
Yeah.
like she's just coming up with an excuse to tell them no because she doesn't want to get married, right? Like, first, it's like, well, Chinese men are not interested in me. I'm too American. And then, white men, I can't marry them. I mean, no, that part was true, right? She couldn't marry a white man in the US because that was illegal at that time. She could have, if she really wanted to, she could have married someone in another country, as many people she knew did do. She knew a bunch of Chinese Americans who were in interracial relationships. But she, declined many marriage proposals over her lifetime. And I think that well, one, she was very close to her family. So she had a family, right? She didn't feel, I think, that loneliness that we might associate
Mhm.
with being single. So she felt very close and tied to her family. And she really was, I mean, she would joke about this, right? She'd say, I'm wed to my career, married to my art. Um, but it was true. Like, that's the thing that she cared most about. And in a sense, she had a traditional view of marriage in that, like, well, if I get married, then I should be a good wife and I should do all the things that come with that. And I'm not ready to do that because I like to travel. Well, I like to have my affairs, and I want to keep doing the work that I'm doing, which I don't think I can do if I'm married. So, of course, I think it was harder later on in life when she didn't have a partner and she had her brother instead to help her. Um, but again, that just goes back to her closeness with her family, right? Her family was always her support system rather than a spouse.
Exactly. Do you think any of the relationships, like who came closest? Do you think that there was a moment or a great love of her life?
I do think it was most likely Eric Mashwitz, the kind of lyricist writer who wrote These Foolish Things, which is a song about her. Um, British guy. He seems to be the one who looms largest in her life. And according to Conrad Doer, who very sadly just passed, so rest in peace, Conrad, but he was 102. He was one of Anna May Wong's tenants. He lived in her kind of apartment complex at Moongate in Santa Monica. But he said, she talked about him as if he were the great love of her life. And so I think maybe that was the man who came closest. But ultimately it was kind of impossible because he couldn't really make a career in Hollywood, and he went back to England, and Anna May Wong, was going to stay on in Hollywood. So
What happened to is Moongate still standing in any way, shape, or form? Like, can I go see it in Santa Monica?
unfortunately not. She sold it in
Course.
1956 and they immediately bulldozed it.
Because of course, because why would you keep that? Like, ugh.
Yeah, yeah, but it is the address still exists, so it's 326 San Vicente in Santa Monica. It's like, 10-minute walk from the beach. So there is a building that's still there that you can, pay homage to in that sense.
Exactly. But she's buried out here in LA, right?
She's buried at the Angeles Rosedale
Okay.
Cemetery. It's actually, I think, probably the first cemetery in Los Angeles that was integrated.
I think
Um,
so, yeah.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of interesting people buried there. I mean, she's there along with her younger sister and her mother. The first Chinese American to play Charlie Chan on screen, Edward Park, is also buried there. And then two of her former directors slash lovers, Todd Browning and Marshall Nealon, are also buried there, and as well as Hattie McDaniel.
Yes. Yeah, I need to go out there because as a Todd Browning fan,
Okay.
I need to go out and and say hello anyway. But now I can go say hi to Anna May Wong and all of them. You know, I loved the way that you talk about, the way she had to inhabit these two worlds, and
Mhm.
documenting her trip to China and how, she was considered too fancy and too American to really fit into those spaces. But to watch some of her films, even though she did talk about the struggles of constantly playing like a tragic character, she's so magnetic, especially in something like Daughter of the Dragon too, where she's acting opposite, Sesue Hayakawa, who also was a revolutionary. Um, I think, for you, how did you want to, I guess, get to that discussion of showcasing that a lot of these actors had the burden of playing, to two different audiences. They were inhabiting all of these different spaces, and they couldn't really fit into either. Anna May Wong was Chinese American, but China and America both said that there were flaws there. I guess, how did you wanna approach telling that story and deconstructing it?
Yeah, I mean, I think I didn't want to like bang people over the head with like, oh, racism, racism,
Yeah.
racism, because like at a certain point we start to tune that out. But I did want to have readers feel empathy for the kinds of conflicts or questions that were constantly being asked of her. And so to me, the best way of doing that was just to tell a story, right? To tell the story of, her becoming famous and then all the interviewers asking her, all these questions and or being surprised that she speaks English or that she's not from China and that she's not, she looks like a porcelain China doll, but then she speaks like a flapper. And so it's like I think the strategy really was like to let you in on the joke so we can laugh together at how silly some of these expectations were.
It's funny too, because to read her interviews in this, and then to read, I'm a big Lupe Velez fan, and to
Mm.
read the interviews that she would give, which were often written in this horrific, like, Latino patois where they had to, like, emphasize how she pronounced words. I was like, I
Yeah.
guess I should give Hollywood credit for not, like, trying to make fun of, like, the anime. Well, I'm kind of surprised that Hollywood wasn't as racist towards her as they were to some of the others. And I'm like, that's
Mm.
not right either. I shouldn't be applauding them for doing that.
Right.
Yeah. It's fascinating though how, your Hedda Hoppers and your Luella Parsons really were, and a lot of those women who were marginalized communities,
Mhm.
definitely all struggled in similar ways, even though
Mhm.
they all had vastly different stories. Is there an element to Anna's anime story that you wanted to include, but just the way that the story was going, page space, that you couldn't fit in?
I mean, there were some smaller episodes. I mean, nothing like super, well, nothing that I thought was, really important that had to be in there. But just some small episodes here and there where, she made friends with some people. I think it was like in Indiana, and they had this lovely estate, and she stayed there, and they had lots of flowers. They had peonies, which was like her favorite flower. So she just like to get away from the press, she spent like a week there, just I don't know, arranging flowers or or something like that. So there were some like little things here and there that were just like pieces of color that would have been nice to include, but for the sake of brevity and also the narrative, I cut them in the end. Um, I'm trying to think if there, I mean, there's so much that you just can't put in a book, which is really why I started a newsletter, because I think I knew that going in. And then, I was every time I'm going to write something for the newsletter, I always tell myself, okay, it's just going to be 1,000 words. And then it ends up being like 3,000 words with all of this like interesting research that I found that just, didn't fit there. So, and someone has told me, like a fan has said that like, oh, the newsletter is really uh like a real time it's like a way to it's like a, what does he call it? Like a software update.
Yeah,
Just
exactly.
yeah, yeah.
Is there a fact about Anime Wong, no matter how small, just something interesting about her that you're just like, that's so cool, like that just sticks with you?
Well, I mean, so many things, but I would say just the fact that she knew what she wanted to do at age 11. I mean, she had such clarity, right?
Yep.
And I mean, the story she tells about her first encounter with one of her screen idols, Mae Murray, and how she's dressed in rags and like, oh, it's like so terrible, like how could she be a movie star, I could do better, like that bravado. I think it's just so impressive. Like I really, it's like, wow, if only I knew I wanted to be a writer at 11.
Exactly, right? Don't we all? I think for me, what I loved was the fact that, she prided herself on having this long, fantastic hair, which I envy. And I think as you
Mhm.
document in the book, she cut it once
Yes.
to do kind of as the flappers do, and she regretted
Right.
it, and she never did it again. And I don't know why that fact sticks out to me, but I love it. I love it because as somebody who like gets so frustrated every time I get long hair, like I'm like, I need to cut it. I'm like, I look at the picture. I actually have a Harel of Anna May Wong that sits over
Oh,
here, and I
nice.
look at it and I'm just like, girl, I don't know how you did it, but that's probably because she had very fine hair and I have like thick, crazy, unruly hair. But
Mm,
I envy
mhm.
her.
Yeah, well, that's the funny thing too, because so many people think that her hair is bobbed, and it's hard
Yep.
to explain to them. I'm like, it's a fake bob, and they're like, what
Yeah.
does that mean? And I'm like, it means that the hair in the front is short, and then it's all in a bun in the back.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I love it. I love it so much. Well, I know you didn't initially set out to write a biography, as you mentioned, like it just came, as you're researching. Can you say you're a biographer now? Do you want to write more biographies going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I guess having written one biography, that I think that does make me a biographer. Do I want to write more biographies? I'm certainly open to the idea, but I don't think it would be my next book.
Right. I feel like you get at least like a couple years reprieve before going into.
Yeah.
I've talked to biographers who immediately are like, I know the next subject, I know what I want to do, and I'm just like, how? How can you just go to the next one? It makes me like sweat just thinking about it. So
Yeah,
yeah.
right.
Katie, oh my gosh, it's been such a treat to get to talk to you. Your book, Not Your China Doll, is wherever you get books. I don't know if you have a preferred way you want people to purchase it, if you're anti-Amazon or not. But where can fans find you, read more of your work? Feel free to plug anything you have upcoming.
Yeah, I mean, anything related to the book, you can check my website, notyourchinadoll.com, which does have links to various retailers, both online and in real life. I also have, as I've mentioned, a Substack newsletter called Half Caste Woman, where I usually like monthly will have a dispatch about something related to Anna May Wong or about Asian American representation in Hollywood. And then I'm also on Instagram at Anna May Wong Book and Katie Sal. And I don't know, is there anywhere else? I mean, Twitter, Kay Salisbury. But yeah, there's tons of places you can find me, but best place to start is notyourchinadoll.com.